Welcome to everybody. I'm Nancy Gallagher. I'm the CISSM director. This is the final CISSM forum of the 21-22 academic year that we are holding jointly with the journalism school. So I'm really excited to be able to do this. We have our speaker today is Drew Sullivan, who's one of the founding directors and publishers of the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. He's a longtime journalist, founded the Center for Investigative Reporting in Bosnia-Herzegovina, among other places. Interestingly, he is also a former structural dynamic engineer on the space station, an actor, a comedian, and a boudron player, whatever that is. So he's going to sing for us. He's going to dance for us. He's going to tell us how to end corruption, all in 30 minutes. And then we've got three panelists who are going to talk with us about how they use the type of reporting that he does in their policy and journalistic work. So thank you very much.
Welcome all. I think you need to do a little bit of dancing and singing to fight corruption. So it's wonderful to have some. I feel bad speaking a lot because we've got three great panelists here who any one of them would be as interesting or more interesting than me. So I'm trying to get this done in about a half hour so we can get into discussion. So I am the co-founder, editor, and publisher of the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Just to give you a sense of who we are, we're basically a network of partner organizations. Think of us as kind of the Uber of investigative reporting. We're a bunch of editors. We have no journalists, and we borrow our journalists from 52 partners and hundreds of publishing partners and other organizations around the world. So we're kind of a platform for investigative reporting. We have the research, the data work, the security, the financing, other things, and then we tie all these together in large international cross-border projects. The effect of this is pretty significant. The cross-border work that ICIJ, which is today represented by Emilia, they're longtime partners of OCCRP. This is very effective in the sense that when you have a large number of newspapers publishing at once a particular project, it does have some impact on corruption. You know, we've had about $7.7 billion seized since we started, overthrew 5 presidents, prime ministers, over 600 arrests. You can have some great impact if you get everybody working together. And we started off in Eastern Europe, but now we're working around the world, typically with networks. We're in 6 continents and are amongst the largest investigative reporting organizations on earth, but you probably haven't heard of us. We keep a very low profile. We don't need a lot of, we're not selling newspapers, so we're kind of geared towards impact and trying to get impact. So it allows us to keep kind of a lower profile. Let's talk about leaks, because OCCRP and ICIJ are known for big leaks. A lot of other organizations are getting in the leak business. It's a very interesting time. I think that the reason why leaks are coming out is, besides probably some state intelligence agencies helping out, I think a lot of people are seeing the world going in a very pointed direction, which scares a lot of people. And so they want journalists to get the information they need to uncover corruption. And we've worked on, from the Panama Papers to Pandora with ICIJ, to OpenLux, the laundromats. I think we had 5 different laundromat leaks. Credit Suisse, you might know us from Suisse Secrets, which just came out recently, Dubai leaks, property in Dubai. But what's interesting is all these leaks, it's very interesting dealing with a leak. First time you get it, you're really excited. You open your computer, you start, you know, it's Vladimir Putin in here. Of course, Vladimir Putin is never in there. But you immediately get disappointed because you're not finding the names you thought. And then you start slowly digging into the information. And you find that, in fact, there's a lot of really good information in there, but you have to dig really deeply and you have to compare a lot of things. And as we've gone through them, you start to see how the world works. I mean, first of all, you know, leaks, the work that the setups by corrupt dictators or autocrats or organized crime figures are by design not easily traced. They're basically split up over jurisdictions. They're split up over service providers. So what you're often getting when you get an individual leak is a slice of what's happening out there in the world. So you might have a giant corrupt network going on, but you're just getting that one Panama service provider, or that one, a BVI company that has some information. And you really have to take all this data and piece it together. And so most organizations that do this have a knowledge management system that they've designed that kind of puts these things together. And the structure of these things are always kind of embedded structures. You'll have a BVI company owning a Panama company, owning a British company, which ultimately owns the asset that you're looking at, maybe a super yacht or a expensive company or a mansion on the Riviera. And so you may only get from a leak part of that process. You get the BVI company owning the Panama company. And then you're kind of stuck. So it really is an iterative process of spending a lot of time, combining a lot of leaks together, and working from data. And I can say, Panama Papers came out about, what, 8 years ago? 6 years ago. 6 years ago, and we're still using the Panama Papers today. We still often use it to find stories. Or we find that other piece of the link, and then we find in Panama paper that final thing that puts it all together and allows us to, demonstrate some kind of corruption. So it really is iterative and long, kind of a long process that is going to go on for years. And we're still doing stories that go back 10 and 15 years to try to explain what's really happening. So our conclusion from looking at this and seeing how things fit together is things are way worse than people know. The world is a very, very corrupt place. Corruption is endemic in many countries. Whole countries are completely and utterly corrupt. That every single aspect of the economy is corrupt. It's very difficult to do good business. This includes, besides the obvious places like Russia and China, but Brazil and Mexico and Indonesia and a lot of other big countries that we generally think of as being fairly capitalist and fairly progressive and fairly Western in their outlook. But corruption is significant, and it goes down to almost every level of the economy. And in the worst cases, this turns into what we really call a mafia state. And could you bring up the slide on captured states? This is a lot of the states we're dealing with now are captured states. And by captured states, I mean systemic, you all know this. I mean, you all are in this business. So, but just to define it so everybody can see, it's really, it's a political system. So not so much as a thing that's happened to someplace, but it's actually a planned political system. And that's a problem. And Russia is the example that we know particularly well from all the years of working with Russia. And in Russia, it's controlled for the most part by Vladimir Vladimirovich and his 5 or 6 cronies. But his control over the state, and this is true in some other states, is really, as you go down and look at all element of public life, it goes to all level of public life. He controls it politically through the United Russia Party, obviously, but he also controls it industrially. And this is what Panama Papers and Pandora really showed us, that people like Timchenko and Prigozhin and all the big oligarchs whose names you hear essentially have been given whole pieces of the economy, gigantic pieces of the economy, so that there isn't really any place left in the economy where it isn't owned by somebody who owes their position to, Putin himself. And that's really, it's actually scary. Many of the companies that you think are nominally independent are actually not, because as you start to dig into the ownership structures, you find that it's controlled by a holding company, which is connected to another oligarch. So I would estimate that somewhere between 85 and 90% of the economy is controlled by a small group of oligarchs. And this is why there's so much interest in tracking down oligarchs. And when I hear these stories about, oh, it's not really the oligarch's fault. No, these are fundamental people to the political organization of captured states. Oligarchs are critical to it. And what they essentially do is act as a giant patronage system for the people. So they control it politically, they control it industrially, they control it militarily, you know, through people like Shoigu, and who's one of the most inner circle people of Putin, the head of the military. But what a lot of people don't realize, they also control it criminally. And this works in an interesting way. In about 2010, 2012, the Russian prosecutorial office arrested almost every major organized crime figure in Russia. And they put them in jail for up to about 6 months. And then they released them all. And they all went back to what they were doing. But somewhere in that step, they suddenly became much more loyal to Russia. And we would find many times criminals involved in what was essentially a case that was beneficial to the state. And so it appears as if, you know, at some point they were put in their cells and told, you're going to do this and you're going to support this. You can do whatever you want. But when we ask you for help, you do this, which is what we think probably happened. And so it's actually a really powerful tool if you think about it. If you're a president and you control the, you know, the local cartel, you know, if you need people killed, if you need, you know, people extorted, you need other things, it's an incredible, nice, off the books kind of tool for you to have. But, you know, Russia also controls people. Well, a couple of other examples that I want to give. And just to show that it actually becomes part of the state, we did a story on a guy named Arslan Gagayev, who is a Ossetian organized crime figure. He ran drugs and other things out of Ossetia, you know, had a murder squad that he killed, I think it was close to 60 people, you know, often for hire, often for other groups, often for state actors. But ironically, he became a head of the state leasing company for their airplane manufacturing business. You know, he has no business experience whatsoever except dealing drugs. And yet he was given that position. And that's typical in Serbia. The minister of health is actually a doctor that was put in the hospitals by a criminal gang to murder people who survived assassination attempts. In fact, he treated Prime Minister Zoran Đinđić when Zoran Đinđić was shot. And he killed people in the hospital when they survived things. And we have a couple cases where we had evidence that this in fact happens. He's now the Minister of Health in Serbia. The National Security Advisor for Serbia had no other business in his life except running the Roma gangs out of Vienna. And so these are people buying in or being invited in because of the contributions by these organized crime gangs into the political power structure and playing significant roles. And this is in these countries, it's not really a matter of, it's not seen as a problematic thing because they're controllable by the state. In the laundromats, we saw a number of cases. The Magnitsky case, which many of you are familiar with, that's the lawyer who died in prison after he identified a tax fraud, the largest tax fraud in Russian history. Again, a number of the people that were involved in that particular case and some of the murders, in fact, in that case, were organized crime people who were essentially acting for state actors who were law enforcement and tax authorities. But what's interesting about that case is when it became public, the Russian government defended the people who were accused of the crime. And in fact, all the records for the crime allegedly blew up in a van explosion, because we know vans explode all the time, and they were all burned up. And so consequently, the Russian state said, they couldn't follow it. But you could see the intimate connections between organized crime and the Russian state in this. And there's literally hundreds of these cases. When one of the first databases we got was a list of an offshore company that was operating out of a bank in Latvia, controlled by a Moldovan company. And it was about $800 million, almost $900 million that went through this account in a period of about 7 months. And as we looked at the data, we could see that the money going in and out was from Russian state companies. It was from Russian state officials. It was from Ukrainian state companies and officials. It was from Moldovan organized crime. It was from Russian organized crime. It was from Vietnamese triad groups operating out of Moscow, and it was from the Sinaloa drug cartel in Mexico, all moving through one anonymous account in a Latvian bank, which clearly shows these kind of relationships that are going on. We weren't able to track down what everything meant in that case, but because we didn't have the other part of we were always missing some part of it, but we did do a number of examples of that did show that there was direct connection between state officials and organized crime. So, but not only does Putin have control criminally, he has control religiously. From the Soviet era, we know from the archives that have come out that the Orthodox Church of Russia was organized. It was administered through the offices of the KGB. And at one point, 9 of the 10 leaders of the Orthodox Church were KGB members. And in one particular telling case, there was a Congress of religious leaders, and 47 of the representatives that went were KGB agents to represent the Orthodox Church. And to this day, we still see, the church has been an aggressive supporter of Putin. They've supported the war. They've basically been, they've almost deified him. They've created this feeling that he is somehow beyond just a man. And then the other parts are the legal system, the judicial system is completely controlled. It's politicized. Navalny goes to prison, others don't. And then journalistically, it's also controlled. There are no longer any independent media. The last just moved out in the last couple of weeks from Russia, but we've been watching this exodus for some time. All our partner organizations were kicked out. OCCRP itself is considered an enemy of the state by the Russian government. We were named a undesirable organization. And so it's essentially, if you think about it from top to bottom, all public spaces are controlled by the state. And that's really what we consider a mafia state. And then this corruption then works down to all levels. So once you see your boss is corrupt, you be corrupt, and funds start to disappear from state agencies. So the police are no longer paid, so they have to go out and harass drivers and get bribes and kickbacks so that they can survive. And it becomes a complete system of essentially criminal activity. So if this was Russia alone, it would be their problem and everything would be fine. But it's not. It actually is a problem because Russia now is uniquely promoting autocracy as a better way of governance. And you'll see this all the time. They've actually come out and said, that the moral fiber of democratic countries is clearly low. And this is it's a problem. These are very corrupt governments, and we need the stability of autocracy, which if you'd said that argument to anybody 10 years ago, you'd say that's crazy. You see it now and you start wondering, I wonder how many people believe it, because, we've seen this in a little bit in America. So other captured states are really, this is a phenomenon that has been growing in places like Serbia, in places like Hungary. They're really truly captured states. There's no probability that the leaders will lose in the elections because they've essentially started to control at every level. And I'll talk about some of those levels. But, Serbia, Hungary, Albania, Kosovo, Bulgaria is in a difficult situation, although it recently had a nominally democratic president elected. Czech Republic has had some issues, although that's gone back a little bit. Poland, North Macedonia, Brazil, Philippines. There's many places that are actually modeling these types of models. You know, they're using some of the same techniques. The steps are pretty clear. The playbook is pretty clear. Number one, fear. You have to get people afraid to accept autocracy. And so you create the enemy without, and the immigrants and the other people are causing the problems. You set up the patronage system that we talked about. You give all your state resources to those people so that they can control them. And then they do favors for you, and they get their workers to vote for you, and they do the other things that you need for that. And then you, of course, capture the chief prosecutor and the head of the police, which is fairly easy through bribes. You control the election systems by suppressing voting and by bribes and by control of the employers. You buy out the media or you control them through advertising. In many of these countries, advertising is weak and a few critical players are important. And it just takes a phone call from somebody to say, do not advertise in that newspaper, which many of our partners have gotten over the years. They've heard about this where people have pulled out and then they become weak and then you can buy them out. As you see in America, there's also been a concentration of media into smaller and smaller numbers of people who own it, and that puts that at risk. You also bribe oppositional parties. Most oppositional parties in most of these countries have no intention of winning an election ever. They're well taken care of, they're well bribed, they're happy, they're there basically for show. To have their, you know, to come out every once in a while and protest and do things. But in many of the countries we deal with, there is no true oppositional parties. They're as easy to buy out as the media, unfortunately. And then you, the diehards that are left, the independent media, the civil society organizations, you attack them, you slander them, you regulate them, you set up, you know, things for foreign agents and other things. You know, if you can't do that, you arrest them, you murder them, you kick them out of the country, you do all sorts of things. And essentially you've got a captured mafia state. You're essentially using democracy to break democracy, which is a core idea of these mafia states. Okay, so what's empowering this? Why is all this happening? Well, an interesting thing happened about, you know, when the Berlin Wall fell. That was actually the same time, 1989, when the internet was invented. And the two have kind of grown together, these kind of independent places and the internet. And at the same time, there was a class developing in some businesses, which we call it the criminal services industry. These are the banks, the law firms, the registration agents, the hedge funds, lobbyists, business intelligence, golden passport purveyors, all these different groups started servicing this new money from the East. And London lawyers, you know, met Russian oligarchs in, you know, the 7th level of hell and built relationships. And they said, hey, we can help you a lot with what you're trying to do. You know, we know this because we've gone to, you know, 20 years ago, not 20 years ago, 10 years ago, we went to many of these service providers and we would come in and we would tell them a crazy story. I just got 1.5 million barrels of Nigerian crude oil and I want to import it, but I don't want to pay any taxes. What these organizations had were off-the-shelf solutions to these problems. Pre-registered companies that were operating in jurisdictions like Seychelles, BVI, Belize, Marshall Islands, that could instantly handle your problem. And that's what essentially happened. This giant industry grew with this profoundly undemocratic money that was coming out of the East. And now this industry is huge. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, you know, probably worth $20–30 billion a year. You've heard some of the famous people involved in it, people like Donald Trump. You know, Donald Trump got a lot of his money by selling in a very discreet way high-end real estate to organized crime figures and, political enemies to the United States, and made a lot of money that way. President Anastasiades of Cyprus started as, a lawyer for Russian, oligarchs moving money out of Russia and wanting to hide it from the state. So this has now become, Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, Steve Bannon. You've heard the names. This is the criminal services industry. They've become rich and they become powerful and they become politically powerful in their own way. What we don't hear about a lot is things like the hedge funds, because this money, really negative blood money has come out. It gets washed through laundromats and other tools, and it ends up in a blue blood hedge fund, which looks like it's just making a nice investment, when it goes into business with some Silicon Valley company. But in fact, it's hedge funds will take your money and do what you want with it to represent you. So it's not like they're mixing the money all the time. They're taking your money, and if you say you want to buy this company, they'll do that for you. They'll do anything you want as long as you got money, and they can make money on the deal. And so consequently, this is a real serious problem, because opaque money is opaque power. And this money funds and represents a lot of things that are not, it's a national security issue. It has been for some time, but it has not been recognized for some time. And so consequently, it's a serious problem. This money is profoundly undemocratic, as I said, and it supports, in the countries where it ends up, very plutocratic laws. It's a tremendous amount of money, because this is money that's been stolen. This is drug money that's been gathered, and organized crime people, they have to launder something like $1 billion a year. They have a lot of money. A lot of it is placed into things like agricultural land. We were looking at the Ndrangheta. We found out 30% of the agricultural land in Eastern Slovakia is owned by the Ndrangheta. And they're doing this all over the place. So it's a great asset to stick money in, because it just sits there and you don't have to manage it. You can lease the land out if you want to, but you don't have to really manage it. High-end real estate, you're seeing, people, there's a demand for $300 million apartments in places like New York and London. They don't want, if you got to, launder $1 billion, why not get $300 million apartments rather than, 1,000 $1 million apartments? So it's really actually, distorted the whole real estate system in places like New York and London and Paris. And so consequently, it's also created a bubble. And we're in this weird situation where, a tremendous amount of money. Can you put up one of the slides? Put up the Russian slide if you can. Here, yeah, go back one. Okay, this is money coming out of Russia. The blue is positive money flows. The yellow is negative money flows. And you can see over time, a tremendous amount of money is poured out of Russia. That has all got to go somewhere. And it's generally, besides the mansions and the yachts, which will account for, maybe 20 billion, but I mean, in 2021, it was $500 billion that flowed out of Russia. I mean, that's every asset that's known right now. And look at all those other years. That's all in hedge funds. That's all in Western investments. We don't really know where it is. And some of this money is really up to no good, because as a oligarch in the Putin government, if you ever want to come back to Russia, and if you don't want your family members arrested, when he asks you to do something, you have to do it. Maybe it's buying a $100 million house in Palm Beach. Even though the market is saying it should be maybe a $50 million house, maybe it's making the kind of deal that is going to be beneficial for a government. And so consequently, let's see what the other slides are. Consequently, this is a problem. Here's total monies, offshore transactions since 1996. And as you can see, I mean, 7.4 trillion, that's about the gross domestic product the United States. What is it, about 13 trillion? I'm not sure what it is. It's somewhere, it's a whole lot. In Paul's words, it's a whole lot of money. And I think I got one more slide in there. Oh yeah, this is offshore, just one jurisdiction. This is gross transactions, the shell company domiciled in the Netherlands. Okay, so this is now a significant international market in its own right, the offshore market. In some ways, it rivals the traditional market. And here's the problem: when putting this all together now, this criminal services industry is really enabling a new global elite who are incredibly powerful with the resources they have, enough potentially to move global trends. And this new global elite is really made of a cast of characters that maybe we wouldn't want to be leading us. People like libertarian billionaires, autocrats, corrupted state actors, organized crime, people who are potentially not acting in our best interest. And it's kind of greased by the this kind of sleazy perfection of the criminal services industry, which even today, with all the attempts to capture oligarch assets and other things, are actively engaged in helping them rehide all this stuff that we've painfully unhid over decades of work. And we're watching almost live as assets. We've been doing a thing called the Russian asset tracker, where we're looking at Russian assets. And almost daily, we see assets changing hands to move to safer places and new jurisdictions where they think that they can bypass the reach of the US government and other governments. And what this this new world is like, this new global elite, they operate in a world that's virtual. It's really stateless. They have multiple passports, thanks to the golden visa and golden passport things, so that they can move to any jurisdiction that they want. Their money is in multiple jurisdictions, usually in offshore places that are hidden and tax-free. And they essentially use unregulated financial instruments, across the world in these kind of jurisdictions to do their business. And the problem with this is that, it essentially works against the things that we're most interested in. It undermines the social fabric. It undermines the power of states. There really is this concept that a border means nothing now. This concept of state is dying, and it's dying to these kind of forces, these kind of other things that are out there, these kind of stateless interests that align themselves, so that you could suddenly have a Donald Trump standing next to an MBS, and a Vladimir Putin, who all find common cause in their interest in state capture. Not philosophical, agreement, but just basically, hey, I need this, can you help me out? And that's what we're getting. And they're promoting societal discord through many different means, such as wedge issues and extremists. The center of politics and the center of life is really hollowing out in places like America. You have very few people who are in the center anymore. Everybody is an extreme in some way, and that makes it more difficult to govern by democracy. Makes it great to govern by autocracy, because that eliminates the problem, because you simply get rid of the people. They're also evading their public, responsibilities, so less and less money is captured, making states even weaker. So we lose something like $500 billion a year because of the offshore industry in money that's evaded. And then at the same time, they're committing crimes. They have become angel investors of criminal activity, because criminal activity really helps them. And so consequently, you will see these, cryptocurrency scams. If you go back and look at them, they often originate from places like Russia. This is called harvesting. Criminal groups do this all the time. You go harvest, you go to America, and you get dumb people to, trusting people to give you their money, and then you fleece them, you know, whether it's a cryptocurrency scam or something like that, or a Ponzi scheme that you set up. And then this not only deprives people of wealth, but it also enriches you, and it causes basically growing resentment. A lot of people are angry now. They're angry because their life has gotten more difficult because systems don't work as well. And these systems don't work as well in part because of all this criminal activity that's going on. And so this is difficult to change, because if you think about it, what you have to be is, in order to fight against it, you have to be a nationalist against the globalists, you know, which is not what a lot of people really want to, you know, it's not how they think. So it's a really challenging and interesting time. And the whole key is to really, what journalism does is help uncover this piece by piece. It's a very difficult process, but piece by piece, we try to uncover each of these little pieces. But since they're spread all over the world, you know, essentially what we find is the only tools we have is cross-border work, cooperation with other journalists and other organizations, and then even working with nonprofit activist groups and other things. We work with Transparency International quite a bit. It's a blurring of lines between activism and journalism, but it's important to have that investigative capacity out there and to work along these lines to uncover these things. And so, you know, that's our mission. That's what we're trying to do. But it's going to be a very difficult problem. My prediction is things will get a little worse before they get better. But I'm hoping that these people disagree with me.
So thank you for that extraordinarily complicated and depressing picture of how all these pieces fit together. We've got three discussants who are going to offer some opening remarks. Emilia Díaz-Struck from the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and Debbie Cenziper, I hope I said that right, from the Washington Post, is an investigative journalist there. And then Paul Massaro works with the Helsinki Commission. He's one of our PhD students as well. And he's going to talk a little bit about how this kind of information gets used in the policy context. And then we can come back to all the other important questions you raised. So thank you very much.
Okay. Great. Is this thing on? Okay, there we go. Wonderful. I'm obligated to say that these are my personal views. I do work for the US government, but this is not any official view of the US government. It is not the official view of the commission or any single commissioner. So with that said, I do think we'd all agree that OCCRP, Drew, the work you guys do, unbelievably important. ICIJ, Forbidden Stories, all the new journalist networks that have cropped up to fight against what is the problem of our time? Global corruption. I mean, this new model is changing everything. And I mean, and not a day goes by where I'm not on OCCRP's website. So I mean, it's, you know, it's just unbelievable work you guys do. I think you did an excellent job describing and diagnosing the problem. I don't want to say anything more to that. I think you nailed it. There's really nothing more to be said. I mean, it's an existential threat to everything we hold dear. It's an existential threat to democracy. It's an existential threat to individuality. It's an existential threat to the United States, you know, and that's why in my career at the Helsinki Commission, I've been there almost a decade now. You know, I've fought very hard, and I think, and I'm happy to say, and I do want to offer a little bit more of an optimistic take, finally succeeded to frame global corruption as a national security threat. And I'll tell you, when we started doing this in 2013, I'd walk into rooms with other national security experts, and I'd say corruption is a national security threat, and they'd be like, what are you talking about? You know, they'd say, what about terrorism? What about kinetic warfare? What about nuclear weapons, which are definitely still a national security threat, that, you know, and absolutely are now more than ever. But that doesn't mean corruption is not. And in fact, global corruption is absolutely a national security threat. And I think that we've recognized that. I think Congress actually recognized it before the executive branch did. I think the people of the United States recognize it. I think if you go anywhere in the USA, you know, constituents on the left, right, whatever, are fed up with corruption. They don't really know what it means necessarily or who's behind it, and they can be pushed in different directions, but everybody's got kind of this intuition that something's not right, and something is not right, and it's our job to get it right, what is not right. And I think that Drew and all his people get it right. and they help us frame the policy. So here's the good news. The president has, first of all, the US Congress established this caucus against foreign corruption and kleptocracy. A day later, the president declared corruption a national security threat to the United States. Since then, we've been on our way to really solving this problem. Last Congress, over President Trump's veto, Congress abolished anonymous shell companies in the United States, which are behind a lot of money laundering. That rule is being made right now and may include some level of anonymous trusts, which I think some of my colleagues are going to talk about a little bit more, although if not, we're going to have to legislate that as well. In December, the executive branch published its first ever US strategy on countering corruption, which includes, all the policy prescriptions. And I want to talk about kind of what I see as the three pillars in just a moment here, but it's everything we've wanted. The strategy was beautiful. It included absolutely everything. That doesn't mean it's all going to get done, but includes pretty much everything. And then despite all that, everything was still slow until Putin invaded Ukraine. And that really fundamentally changed everything. It's not Putin. I think Putin had the right idea. I think that he saw that democracy was weak. He saw he could, we'd never responded to him before because of elite capture through global corruption after the 2008 invasion of Georgia, 2014 invasion of Ukraine, abuse of Interpol, assassinations in the UK and Berlin. I mean, it's just, I could go off, but, we never really deterred him. So he's, okay, I can take Kiev. But he didn't calculate with the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians turned out to be the real people that are showing us now. I wear my Ukraine pin today, but showing us how to do democracy and what it means to fight for democracy. And because of that, I think we had to take a hard look in the mirror and say, okay, we've got to commit to the values we claim to believe in that we don't always really abide by. So the three pillars, as I see them, to fix this problem are: one, we got to clean up our act at home, which means we've got to shut down the criminal services industry. I call them the enablers. People call them the enablers around. I think it definitely goes beyond kind of the really, wacky pinstriped ones like Roger Stone. I think it actually includes a lot of people that you'd otherwise think of as very respectable. I think it includes most of the most expensive law firms in New York City, I'm sad to say. It includes a lot of lobbyists around town. It includes a lot of people who would otherwise be, you wouldn't even notice. They wouldn't even think of themselves as doing something wrong necessarily. And that's what has to change. We have to start seeing accepting dictator money as wrong. The second thing is actually punishing the kleptocrats themselves, which we've done in a huge way in the past few weeks. Massive sanctions, law enforcement action, everything else. And then the third thing is helping fledgling democracies in a more effective way to realize their ambitions of the rule of law. And I think that we're going to have another opportunity to do that now after what I think was many years of sort of democracy on the back foot, and get into what that might look like. But in any case, last thing I want to say is that the Biden administration just today, after an almost unanimous vote yesterday that the USA must seize oligarch assets and hand them to Ukraine, the Biden administration just today put out its extremely ambitious plan to seize oligarch assets. That includes the most ambitious proposal I've ever seen that would criminalize the possession of money related to the Russian regime. The possession. I mean, that's all the oligarchs criminally. That's all the enablers criminally. I mean, I thought when I read that, what if we did this with the CCP? We'd have to arrest half the CEOs in America. Anyway, I think there's a lot of good reason to be optimistic, but it's because of people like Drew, OCCRP, ICIJ, that have shown us the massive, the enormity of the problem and what it actually is beyond just the pure intuition of something is wrong. So, thank you, Drew, and your organization. And that's all I got to say.
Thanks very much. It's an honor to be here, and well, thanks, Drew. I will complement some of the things that Drew has been talking about. I actually agree with many of those things. So, but so I'm part of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and ICIJ was created 25 years ago, actually, and it started, of course, as a network of investigative journalists. And the era of the leaks that Drew was talking about started about nearly 10 years ago, actually, the offshore leaks. The first one we worked on and that ICIJ got was a project that popularly is known as offshore leaks, but it actually, its name was Secrecy for Sale. And it started with a hard drive that then Jared Ryle, our director, came from Australia from an investigation that he was doing actually in money laundering on a scandal in Australia called Firepower. But that started like, or triggered all these global collaborations. And it was at that time, and I've had the honor of working since then and many different roles in many of these offshore projects. So that collaboration, we had about 100 reporters working on it, and including colleagues from OCCRP and other parts of the world. Our last project, Pandora Papers, that OCCRP, the Washington Post, but more than 150 media outlets were part of it, involved about more than 600 journalists around the world to uncover this complex world. And what we have seen throughout these years is how things get more and more complex and more complicated. And it's not only in terms of where the money is going, how the assets are hidden. It's basically, you see when regulations are changed, then how creative then organized crime, politicians who are connected to corrupt activities, and others, people who want to avoid taxes, to get more sophisticated. And the intermediaries offer new plans to new solutions to the new regulations that are taking place. So that's something that we see, and that we have been able to see throughout the years, how complicated it can get. Actually, something that stood out, like for us when we were looking at the Pandora Papers, was the amount of politicians that were in the data, because that also tells us that people who are supposed to also help change the system are benefiting from it. And the uses were diverse. Like, it could be like buying property, it could be hiding assets, and some of those cases were also connected to corruption cases. We had more than 330 politicians that were using offshore companies in the Pandora Papers, 35 of them country leaders, current and former country leaders. That also tells us something. Out of that specifically, that was over more than 11.9 million records, we had actually over 4,000 Russians. I think Russia was one of the countries with the largest proportion of beneficial owners in the data, followed by other countries such as Brazil, Ukraine, Venezuela, who were at the top of the users of the offshore economy these days. You have a variety of users, which is what Drew was talking about. But that is the starting point, because when we just look at these leaks, when we get the millions of records and like all the other leaks that Drew was talking about, the data is just the starting point, because we can know, for example, that one person is connected to a company, but what was that company used for? And sometimes you have like this complex shell game where a company is owned by another company, and you can go in so many layers until you can go until the end and know who is the final owner. You can see sometimes the impact of regulation. So with Pandora Papers, we saw, and we got a very privileged amount of information on beneficial owners, like the final people who are behind the companies. And that was not casual. That was because in the Pandora Papers, we got reports that 14 offshore service providers, like out of the ones, I think about half were connected and operating in the BVI, had to send to the BVI because after the Panama Papers, there was a change of regulation that forced them to tell the BVI who was behind of those companies. But that information is not public, but we were able to know just because of that. So you can see sometimes how the impact changes things, but then what happens next? Then they move to other jurisdictions, or like, and that we saw it, for instance, with Panama Papers. So we saw like how when there were like changes on bearer share regulations, then they go to other jurisdictions. It doesn't stop there. So the way to tackle this journalistically is by the power of collaboration, because we have partners such as OCCRP, the Post, but partners all around the world who have the best sources, but also who know how to connect the dots, because this is very complex. So you can see the money flowing. So then you have a property purchase in the UK, but then the company was registered in the BVI, and then the bank was in Latvia. And then like that involved also owners that were connected to the Middle East. So then those networks are all connected through the power of journalism in that way. And that's how we can uncover them. And it's not only because the leak told us that there is a person connected to a company. And sometimes then you go and you need to validate through public records. And then you see the problem that you have sometimes with public records, the quality of the data that you have when you need to connect the dots. You need to go then to court records, you need to go to corporate registries, but still there is an issue in terms of transparency and how much information you can get through public records. So there is a lot of work to be done. And the other element that we see constantly is what you both were talking about, which is the role of enablers. So we see not only the offshore service providers, but law firms who provide advice. And what role do they play? The role of banks. When we worked on the FinCEN files, that was this leak that BuzzFeed News got, shared with ICIJ, we shared with media partners all around the world, we saw other kind of problems that banks were facing. So banks, for instance, didn't know how to trace some of the money. So you could see how they were trying to figure out who was behind transactions that they were flagging as suspicious. And sometimes, in some cases, they encounter a lot of offshore entities. And so they were using systems to try to figure out, but in other cases, they failed to report those transactions in a timely manner. And then you had like transactions flowing that were connected to suspicious activities that flew and were not stopped because of failures in the system too. And sometimes what we also saw is heavily data quality problems. So when we were working on the FinCEN files and the reports that FinCEN authorities were receiving, so if you look at all the different layers, for instance, when you look, and that's because, well, I also work with data, we were looking at all the countries and the country codes, and half of the countries were wrong. You had the addresses and the countries and they were not matching. So we had to check and validate that. You had addresses in China and Switzerland using the same country code. So if you are an authority monitoring these reports, what does it take to see what you're receiving from these intermediaries? So there are many different layers that make it very complex to trace. But I think it's super important the work organizations like OCCRP, ICIJ, our colleagues at the Post, and our partners around the world do. And it's also the problem of free press freedom that we face, because in many of the countries where our partners work, is high risk to do journalism. So the way to protect journalists, the way to be able to fight censorship is through global collaborations. I will leave it there because I think it's a short comment, but I agree with many of the things that Drew said. And well, I hope we can continue having possibilities to working on these global projects and helping bring transparency. But yeah, there is a lot of work to do, and things get more and more complicated, even though regulations are changed in some countries. The impact we can see is also very powerful when we do these projects. So regulations change, money recovered, but still a lot of work to do.
Hi, everyone. I'm Debbie Cenziper. I write for the Washington Post. And I have to say, I've spent most of my career as an investigative reporter focusing on domestic issues and, fraud and corruption in the US government and in state government. So I'm new to Drew's world. And I think it might be a good thing, because after listening to your talk, I might not sleep tonight. So thank you for that very much. But one of the first things I realized when we partnered with ICIJ on the Pandora Papers leak, and in spending weeks, digging through 11.9 million records, which is really not possible to dig through 11.9 million records, but wading in the muck, we like to call it. But one of the things I realized early on is that the US, as you all know, plays a very significant role in this world, and that there is really no more offshore, it's onshore. And so I really wanted to spend my time as a point person at the Post focused on the US role in the world that Drew described. And what we realized early on is that state laws enable the kind of corruption that we've been talking about today. And these are not necessarily places like New York and Miami, although they play a role, but our reporting led us to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and to Sheridan, Wyoming. You know, I remember in Sioux Falls, one of the trust companies that we wrote about that was part of this leak had its headquarters just upstairs from the convention center in Sioux Falls. It was just across the street from a Holiday Inn. I mean, this is the heart of America, and these are places where foreign money is going. And you know, the world is very small, and so assets that may have been hidden in tropical countries, island countries somewhere, are now here in the U.S. in part because states like Alaska, Nevada, and South Dakota you know, created laws that made the US a safe haven. And I was really surprised by that. And what we found in our work in the Pandora papers is or how many bad actors from outside the United States had set up trusts and LLCs here in the United States, from oligarchs to criminals to people who have, you know, really been in trouble before for human rights and labor violations. And they've come into the United States under the nose of the federal governments. And they've set up their trusts and their limited liability companies here in places that I didn't know they would, you know, the places that we least expected. And so I think one of the roles that we played, that we must play as journalists in writing about this world, is helping readers understand why this is a problem. I think when I came into this, part of me thought, well, this is what some wealthy people do. It's the rich doing, you know, what we would expect. It's bad people doing what they would expect. But what we really wanted to do in our reporting is focus on people who are left behind, that there are vulnerable communities all over the world who are impacted when money is hidden. And we really spent a lot of time going to a sugarcane field in the Dominican Republic to write about people there who are impacted by this great and secret movement, covert movement of wealth. We went to Wyoming, and we really wanted to find families who were affected by this. And so Drew talked about this great threat to democracy and to all of these, you know, incredibly important reasons why we should care about the lack of transparency. But what we wanted to do beyond that is to focus on individual people, communities all over the world who are impacted when money is moved outside their countries and outside their communities and hidden, of all places, here in the United States. So I wanted to leave it at that because I know we're running late on time and we wanted to have some questions.
So thank you very much to the three of you. Each one of you could have been the speaker in your own right for an hour or more. I'm going to, since we only have about 15 minutes and we've got both a great in-person audience and an online audience, turn the traffic control over to Phoebe, who can hopefully alternate between calling on people who are physically in the room and people who are online. If you are online and want to ask a question, do you want the virtual hand? Phoebe, yes. She's shaking her hand for virtual hand. So Phoebe, over to you.
Okay, we'll start with an in-person question because I don't see any hands online.
Hello, my name is Tony Daly. I'm with the News Guild, CWA, representing Washington Post journalists. And we have been extremely concerned with private equity and hedge funds controlling local news. The duopoly in local news right now, what I would call Alden Global Capital, which actually owns two chains, Tribune and Media News Group, as well as Gannett, which was formed by Fortress Investment Group. Now control not just 40% of daily papers in this country, but they also control the wage rates of journalists, as we've found through statistical analysis. I guess my question to the four of you would be, if you had examples of some of the corruption. You mentioned BVI, you mentioned other jurisdictions. You didn't mention the Cayman Islands. Tribune Publishing, for instance, was purchased by Alden Global Capital with 2 funds, which are located in the Cayman Islands. Now, with my limited, I don't have a network. I'm one person in an office in Judiciary Square. I don't have the capability to be able to trace those funds. But it would be interesting to know the extent to which this criminal services network has infiltrated the Cayman Islands and how it's gotten their funds into some of the more established hedge funds like Cerberus Management, which provided the loans for Alden Capital, or Apollo, which is right now financing the Tegna deal through Standard General. So these are kind of the blue blood, if you will, of Wall Street. But it sounds from what you were saying, the 4 of you, that the blue blood is also kind of tainted. And so if you could actually maybe give some examples, I don't know to what extent you've delved deeply into these particular issues, into those questions.
Well, from having watched the Hungarian media disappear almost, over a year, the Serbian media disappear over a year. A lot of it was done initially by owners of publications that were offshore, and then their true colors did not come out until a period of time later. Because the hedge fund industry is completely unregulated, you don't know if that's the hedge fund, all the people in the hedge fund, one person in the hedge fund, you just don't know. And consequently, it's very troubling to see so much of the domestic media market in the hands of people we don't know who they are. And my experience is that doesn't mean something good, usually, unfortunately. But I don't know, it's very difficult as a reporter to get that kind of information, although we're asking for leaks from hedge funds now more often. So you guys have anything to add to that? Or
To your question, so essentially the Caymans. So Caymans, huge problem, well-known problem. British overseas territories and crown dependencies are a huge problem. There is, again, I guess I joke because I talk with journalists all the time, and it's that our job is to be optimistic in government and believe we can fix things, and their job is to be like, no, you can't, and it keeps us on our toes. So, there was a lot of frustration with the Brits for a really long time because there was a notion that they were under elite capture, basically, that their financial system is the basis of their economy, and that their financial system is basically dependent upon mafia states. We put a big thumb on them and complained about that very publicly. And so I got to tell you, since the invasion of Ukraine, I'm very impressed with the Brits, much more impressed than, for example, with the Germans, who have seemed to have a really rough time sticking with the alliance and seem to have to be pushed into everything. The Brits really actually came out swinging with like over 800 oligarch designations. And when you designate these guys, first of all, they have a sanction system that's much faster than ours for a number of reasons, but they have 7 billion frozen in the Caymans now, 7 billion frozen in Jersey of oligarch assets. I mean, so if the Brits really are able to like turn this into a new thing and stand for democracy again, I mean, it can turn on a dime. See, the problem is that all the bad money is in our system, and it's subtle, it's corrosive, you can't see it, and when you can't see it, it starts getting political decisions that are not favorable to most people. But if we turn that back around on the bad guys and start freezing their assets and start going, then we can actually use the dependency against them, and that's kind of what we're seeing right now. But that took sadly huge costs. It took the invasion of Ukraine. So I think there are questions as to whether that'll be sustainable. So are we in a new world, or is this a one-off?
I was just briefly going to comment on the topic of secrecy jurisdictions. We mentioned regularly BVI because it has appeared across all the leaks, but actually what we have seen is based on where the offshore service provider is, the jurisdictions they operate, then the connections we have. So we had an auto leak called Paradise Papers that our colleagues at Deutsche Zeitung got and shared with us. And that one was heavy on, for instance, Bermuda and also the Cayman Islands. So we had thousands of shell companies there, and we explored also the deals connected to organized crime, politicians, corruption, going through those jurisdictions. So there are plenty of secrecy jurisdictions. And what we also see is that actors in some countries prefer some jurisdictions over others. Some people wonder sometimes, oh, where is the US in the Panama Papers? There were US people in the Panama Papers, but we had more in the Paradise Papers, for instance, and it depends on the providers and where they go to. We have a public website called offshoreleaks.icj.org. You can explore, there's some information there. If you find anything interesting, contact us. We're always happy to also collaborate and help if there are other colleagues who, journalists who wants to explore some of these topics. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a question online from Arfa. Hope I said that right.
Hi, yes. My name is Arfa. I'm actually a student. It's great to hear all of your talks. My question is open to anyone, but I would say maybe Drew specifically. When you mentioned the mafia states, a lot of the countries that you mentioned seem to be Eastern European countries. I was wondering if you had any knowledge of something like that in Southeast Asia or Asian countries like Pakistan, and then within, I guess, Pakistan, I know that there have been talks of the current government that's there, the Nawaz Sharif and Shehbaz Sharif family. I wonder if they were like mentioned in one of the Pandora or Panama Papers, and if there is any like legitimacy to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think India is a good example of a country that is increasingly becoming very much, it's moving towards a captured state. I'm not familiar with Pakistan, but I think a lot of these countries, what's happened is, corruption is an innovation, and innovations spread, and the criminal services industry teach new people about how they can do things. And they help enable it. So, in South Carolina, for probably about $200,000, they hired some lobbyists to go in and get some things passed in South Dakota so that they could, get a trust fund set up, and it was relatively cheap, and then people started using it. And I think that you have people like, Steve Bannon going around teaching people, anti-democratic movements. You got people, going around helping people move specific money for specific things. And you have people, it used to be the organization that was in the UK that splintered, got shut down. Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica was teaching people how to basically use misinformation and propaganda and other techniques to win elections. So you have a lot of people teaching this kind of state capture techniques around the world. And so most states are in some level of in between. They have elements of this going on in some political parties and not in others, and some things have been captured and other things haven't. So you see it in a lot of countries moving very quickly. Romania passed a law making anybody associated with the government immune to any criminal charges. These are the kind of ideas. This is the innovation that's going on in criminal services. And so you'll see that in every country on earth. There's some element of this. We're working in the Pacific now, and in small Pacific islands, they're doing stuff that is right out of Slovakia. It's innovation in its own way.
Okay, we have time for one more very brief question. I don't know how to choose. Do you want to call on someone?
You're the boss.
Oh, man.
Thank you. Brief. Okay, I'll make it brief. I had two, but now I'm going to have one question. Can you talk about U.S. Capacity to investigate and enforce corrupt activity? I'm thinking about the FBI in particular, and what is their capability? And has it actually grown much?
It's a great question. We have the best law enforcement bodies in the world. I mean, bar none. It's unbelievable what the DOJ is capable of. The Treasury, incredible, dedicated people. Even when you have the best in the world, if there's no information available, you're going to hit a lot of pitfalls. Most investigations that succeed in this environment in which we do not have transparency. I mean, that's kind of a lot of what we work on. We didn't talk about the Enablers Act or which we're trying to, get due diligence obligations on gatekeepers and the, abolition of anonymous shell companies. All this kind of stuff is about creating more tripwires and transparency, precisely so investigators can, have more success in these kinds of cases. Almost every single one that's been successful is because of a whistleblower. Whistleblowers are the absolute most important piece of every single one of these investigations. And in fact, now, as of like 2 months, and this is very cool, there's a kleptocracy asset recovery rewards program. So if you come to us, okay, this is for all of you, especially the students, if you want to grow up to be a kleptocrat bounty hunter,
I'll take 10%. I'll tell you how to do it. Okay?
Yeah, go to Drew. If you come to us with information that leads to the recovery of funds that were stolen and hidden in the United States, you can keep whatever. I mean, it's 10 to 30%, something like that. I mean, like that, it's a determined award by the Attorney General, but that exists now, and it's modeled off all of our other whistleblower programs. But it's in place. It's done. I mean, it's not just legislated. It's implemented. It's there. I'm not sure. I mean, you'd have to work that out with in most cases, I don't believe so, but I mean, because they need you to testify at some point, but that's something you work it out with DOJ, but I mean, it's there, it's there.
Oh, I would just add to that. One of the stories we did for the Pandora Papers focused on how robust the enforcement system is here in the United States, because we had tracked assets of criminals in the US offshore to Belize. And they had moved their assets offshore in many cases while they were under criminal investigation. So under the noses of investigators. And what we found in talking to former FBI, former IRS, former DEA, and former Justice is that there are a number of people who want to do more, and they've been able to do more in the past. And they say in some cases there hasn't been the political will potentially to prosecute. And it's hard because, as we all know, the investigations often stop at our borders. They can't do anymore unless another country is willing to help. And so it'll be interesting to see what some of these new proposals and priorities do to change that.
So this is exactly what I love, when we have far more questions than we have time to take the questions, and I can just see everybody's heads spinning with all sorts of interesting things that they would like to do to follow up on this. So I've already got some new fundraising ideas for CISSM. I just have to find myself. And also some research ideas. And I'm hoping that some of the students have ideas for their capstone project that they might like to work on. So hopefully this is the start of an ongoing collaboration, because this is a very serious problem. And I appreciate all the work you're doing. So thank you.